Hello and welcome to another episode of the series Before You Buy, where I look at new games and releases without unnecessary talk and tell you what you can really expect from them. Today it's a bit of a bigger package, because it's not just about one ordinary thing. Starfield has finally arrived on PlayStation, and at the same time, a major update called Free Lanes has been released for all players. On top of that, Bethesda has released another major DLC called Terran Army, so in a single day, several reasons suddenly appeared around Starfield to return to it or finally try it for the first time. And that's exactly the main question. Does this new update even make sense? Is the DLC worth it? And how well does the PlayStation version actually work? Because Bethesda made a real effort to say in advance that this isn't some kind of Starfield 2.0, that it's not a major transformation of the whole game that would suddenly miraculously rewrite it from the ground up. But of course, that's exactly what everyone is asking anyway, whether Freelance and the new DLC can do for Starfield what the big update and Phantom Liberty did for Cyberpunk. So, to answer directly, no, this really isn't Starfield 2.0, and honestly, it's not even close. There are some better moments here though. Some of the changes aren't entirely negligible, and some things work better than before, but it's definitely not enough to turn a game that already left me pretty cold into a great game all of a sudden. On the contrary, overall, this new package feels to me more like yet another layer of systems added to an already overcrowded game that still doesn't really know what it wants to be. And unfortunately, I feel that this is most apparent in Freelance. In theory, it's actually quite a logical thing. A new space travel mode that lets you move between planets within the same system without constantly having to click through menus. That sounds good, because having to go through menus and loading screens has been one of the most annoying parts of the whole game from the very beginning. So when Bethesda announced this, it sounded like a step in the right direction, but in practice it feels more like a half-baked solution that was tacked onto Starfield after the fact. And it shows. Cruise mode, that new way of moving, is activated by holding down a button, the HUD changes, and you can fly within the system to another planet to points of interest or just move through space. But the problem is that the game was clearly never really designed for something like this. The planets are still separate instances, the local space and the actual transition between locations still work on the old foundations. So as soon as you approach your target, there's that same strange transition into another layer of space. The result? Instead of making travel simpler and more enjoyable, I often feel like I'm just going through yet another extra step before I end up at another transition and more waiting anyway. And that's exactly the problem. Cruise mode doesn't feel like a natural part of the game. It feels like an add-on mod added after the fact. Like a mod or experiment that sounds better on paper than it does in actual gameplay. Moreover, flying this way isn't particularly fun. It's slow and at times even tedious. And if you want to speed up your journey, you can easily overshoot your destination. And since the universe in Starfield doesn't feel particularly lively or interesting most of the time anyway, you're really just spending more time in a vast black void. And that brings me to the main point. Freelance does add a lot of things to the game, but most of them feel more like extra little details rather than something that truly changes the core experience. There's a new resource, X-Tech, for modifying weapons and ships. There are new legendary effects. A new shared container for outposts, a more organized information database, pets for outposts, upgrading Starborn abilities without needing New Game Plus, the ability to carry equipment over into New Game Plus, anchor point station in deep space with new quests, new points of interest on planets, new elite crew members, and a ton of other little details that Bethesda leaves for players to discover. On paper that's a lot, but when I look at it as a whole, I don't get the feeling that the game has fundamentally changed. It's still Starfield with the same problems, still the same emptiness, still the same bland story, still shooting that's just okay, still constant loading screens, still the same feeling that the game wants to be huge, but inside it's often terribly superficial. The Terran Armada DLC then explains some of these new features and uses them in the campaign, so it almost feels like an extended tutorial for some of the new mechanics. But even here there's a problem. The game recommends starting this content only around level 50. That's strange in itself, because it's actually content that introduces you to things that mean things, which the update adds as important new features, but at the same time, it pushes you into them only when you've already finished most of the game. And what's even worse is what the DLC actually does. As soon as I start to get into it a bit, a new system of incursions begins to appear on the map, situations where Terrans show up in a system and I can't fast travel away as usual until I solve the problem, or at least fly far enough away. That might sound like a minor complication, but in reality it's a pretty annoying system that gets old very quickly. These incursions are very similar to each other, forcing me to do the same thing over and over again, and on top of that, they lock me into the part of Starfield I enjoy the least, space combat. And the worst part is, you can't just turn it off normally. I can lower the frequency, but I can't get rid of it completely. And the DLC relies on it way too much. Instead of offering an interesting campaign with better pacing, it actually starts to slow the player down with this very system. You do one incursion, then another, and another, and in between you just feel like the game is dragging things out. That's exactly the kind of padding in games that really wears me out. It's not like there aren't any decent moments at all. Sometimes a mission pops up that's better, sometimes a new weapon is a nice surprise. The Terran equipment is quite powerful, and some of the new weapons are actually pretty nice to use. And one of the new companions, Robot Delta, paradoxically ends up being one of the most interesting characters I've had by my side in Starfield. It's nothing miraculous, but compared to most of the sterile and overly safe characters from the base game, it actually feels almost refreshing. But all of that isn't enough, because the DLC story is boring and drawn out. And for the amount of time it demands from me, it offers far too little that's actually interesting. And now about the PlayStation version. I played all this new content on the PlayStation 5 Pro. And this is exactly where I expected that at least the technical side would be relatively fine. After all, Starfield isn't a new game, it's been out for quite a while, and if a new release is coming to another platform now, I would expect that at least technically it would be sufficiently polished, but it isn't. The game isn't completely broken, but its technical state really disappointed me. And that's especially true on the PlayStation 5 Pro, where you'd expect some level of reliability. The default setting starts at 30 frames per second, and honestly, it feels pretty sluggish. Personally, I don't always have a fundamental problem with 30 frames per second, but here it just didn't work for me. Moreover, the configuration options are surprisingly chaotic. I can adjust the FPS, VSync, graphic priorities and other things separately, which is almost like tweaking a PC version, except here I'm doing it on a console with a gamepad and it just doesn't feel comfortable. And if I turn on enhanced mode on the PS5 Pro and try for 60 frames per second, I run into an even bigger problem. Yes, the game allows it, but stability takes a significant hit. I had several game crashes, not just minor stutters, but actual hard crashes. And that's just bad. With a game that's over 2 years old from a major publisher, this is really not something I want to be dealing with. On top of that, there are the usual bugs, graphical glitches, unstable performance, FPS issues, and FPS drops in places where I wouldn't expect them. And that's what bothers me the most, because Starfield isn't some technological marvel that has to do anything incredibly demanding on screen. Part of the game takes place in a fairly empty space or in isolated interiors, and yet the performance still fluctuates, so as for the PlayStation version, I wouldn't say it's outright catastrophic, it's playable, but it's definitely not the version that would make me say now is the perfect time to jump into Starfield. If I have the option to play on PC, I would still go for that. And if I don't have that option, then at the very least, I would seriously consider whether this package even interests me enough to pay full price for it. And you know what's the strangest thing about all of this? The thing that I probably enjoyed the most out of this whole update package is just a completely ordinary new vehicle. That dune buggy style machine, which you can use for exploring planets, is actually one of the few new features where I really felt like I was having fun. It's not perfectly controllable, it can behave strangely in tight spaces, but at least it adds something more lively to the game, something that's not just another menu, another system, or another half-functional layer. It's simply a bit of fun. And I think that's quite telling for Starfield, because this game has always felt incredibly flat and tired to me, like a huge project that can do a lot of things, but only does very few of them really well. And that's exactly why I have a hard time seeing this update and DLC as something that will significantly move the game forward. Yes, freelance improves it a bit, yes, a few of the new features are nice, yes, some of it might entertain players who already like Starfield, but if the game didn't grab me before, this really isn't going to bring me back. And if someone now wants to start playing it because of the PlayStation version, I honestly can't really recommend it to them in good conscience. The saddest thing about all this is probably that, in my opinion, Starfield isn't an unsolvable problem. It would just need a much bigger overhaul, much bolder changes, fewer extra systems, and more focus on what is actually supposed to work. But that's exactly what I don't see here. So to sum it up, Freelance is more of a tacked-on system than something that fundamentally changes the game. Terran Armada is a boring and unnecessarily drawn-out DLC. The PlayStation 5 Pro version is unnecessarily unstable and technically weaker than it should be. And in the end, the best new addition is just an ordinary vehicle, which at least for a moment reminded me that the game can actually be fun. If you already own Starfield, feel free to try out some of those free new features. Some of them might suit you, but if you're expecting a big reason to come back, or even a moment when it finally becomes a great game, I'd be very cautious. For me, this still isn't enough. And rather than feeling like staying in Starfield any longer, after all this, I once again had the same feeling as before, that it's a game with huge potential that still hasn't managed to fulfill it.